Granite Station Fuel and Go, written by Dark Prince 010. Granite Station had been forgotten by nearly all who had travelled past it, even those who stopped for a quick refuel and a bite of something slightly fresher than dehydrated rations and cubes. The ship fuel depot was one of the hundreds of such waypoints, and while it was technically mobile, it could always be found anchored at the edge of the granite-filled asteroid belt that gave it its name. These asteroids were barely worth the credits of blasting semi-precious metals out of them, and so it was frequented often by only the most hard-put-on miners and free haulers. The station was a veritable ship of Theseus, a custom amalgamation of bits and pieces of slightly less broken starships and station platforms cobbled together over nearly 3 decades, and it was Goodman's pride and joy. Humans were seemingly one of the few races in the galaxy who didn't mind a life of unglamorous and often underappreciated work. Goodman himself often said that he wanted nothing more out of life than to help where he was needed, and maybe one day go sightseeing across the stars. This entire arm of the galaxy was dotted with dozens of such stations, each typically offering fuel and amenities for crews passing by, but rarely visited by Royal Star Cruisers or World Defense fleets. Those larger vessels had power and resupply needs far in excess of what a lone, modest station like Goodman's could provide, even immediately after a full restocking. For less important ships and schedules, though, often for the mining cost of the Garanians, Lufan workers, or even humans themselves, such a fuel depot was a welcome stop for ships running on fumes, hoping to carry a modest cargo just a bit further to eke out a living. Many years had passed, with Goodman's son and daughter both growing from bouncing toddlers he often had to weave between while cooking up still wiggling alien tentacles for patrons, to now helping just as much as he did, sometimes more. When the years reminded him of their presence, and he needed to take a breather, he could count on Charlotte and David to pick up the slack. Just like his old man, David managed to make 1 meal's worth of supplies feed half a dozen, while Charlotte had more accuracy with the fueling port crane than he ever did, often getting his ship hooked up and halfway filled before her old man would have even secured a latch. Goodman sometimes joked that Granite Station's one modest claim to fame was its relative proximity to Italine, the capital of the Imperium of the Allied Systems and a hub world for billions. The planet was so densely packed that it was said one could live, grow old and die, and never see the unobstructed night sky overhead. Goodman often told his children this was truly how the station got its name, not from an asteroid belt, but because, as he'd say, with a chuckle and a knowing wink, we are always taken for granite. The joke never failed to draw groans and a few chuckles from his long-suffering children. The events of the Tarkanian burst began with the simple static across radio signals of the hyperplayer radio, something even a few firm slaps to the aged device failed to fix. Goodman usually assumed such things were caused by fading, worn-out tech, since the entire fuel depot was cobbled together from parts of varying ages and conditions. However, when other miners and haulers reported their ship communications were also disrupted, Goodman began to worry the problem might be bigger than a broken radio. The hollow radio channel Goodman always listened to, Tynovus Prime, was broadcast from a famous planet of the same name, a massive hub of antennas and transmitters with such redundancies that disruptions rarely occurred and, if they did, lasted only seconds. By this time no response came. Nearly all the one-way planetary channels were filled to static, while the two-way ship-based channels carried disjointed reports of damage, disruption, chaos, and people fleeing from a disaster still unfolding. A survey probe ship between jobs for the Royal Takada had ventured deeper than most dared to into a zone of destruction. It reported that the path of the devastation seemed to follow a singular direction, rowing back towards what had been considered a safely distant black hole, dubbed Tarkanian. The astrological phenomenon had only been lightly catalogued, and the reports had missed a dark gas giant in its orbit. The massive planet's countless of tons of mass unilluminated by the nearby stars. It appeared that in the millennia since the gas giant's decaying orbit brought it close enough for its atmosphere to be ripped away, suddenly adding billions of tons of charged gas back to the hole's accretion disk. The result was a massive, tightly focused beam of high-energy, radioactive particles emitted along the black hole's axis. This quasar, though, anticipated to be short-lived as far as the astronomical phenomena go, was calculated to pour forth its power for hours, perhaps even days, while the gas was consumed and obliterated. As communications were gradually restored while the Tarkanian quasar's pulse faded, attention turned to the beam's trajectory. The capital of the allied planet's Italine was perilously close to the perimeter of the beam. While the capital avoided the edge of the beam by hundreds of millions of kilometers, the communications world, Tibonus Prime, was not as fortunate. It was sterilized, vast swaths of its surface turned to outright slag by the sheer force of the flare. Somber relief at the capital world's survival soon turned to horror. Observations revealed that while the planet itself had been spared, its star had received a glancing blow from the beam. This impact wasn't enough to immediately trigger a supernova, a small miracle in and of itself. But the star's stability was irreparably compromised. With each passing day, solar flares began lashing out repeatedly, scouring towards the capital world itself. This threat galvanized action. Hundreds of fleets filled with warships, carriers, and other ponderous vessels from across the Alliance mobilized. Evacuating the entire planet was deemed effectively impossible. But another plan began to unfold, even as transports began trying to save what small fraction of the populace they could. The large ships were flown into careful orbits around the capital planet, and these vessels extended their protective shield bubbles to form a lattice of shielding between thousands of ships, effectively replicating a planetary shield facing off against a raging star. Goodman and the others watched with bated breath, as the maneuver had been just in the nick of time, too, as the magnetic belts around the planet began to falter. With each new solar flare, the planet's natural defenses were becoming exhausted, allowing more and more dangerous radiation to seep through. But now, thanks to the planetary shield lattice, they had bought some time. How much time, however, was uncertain. The sun continued to shudder, struggling against the forces tearing it apart. The frequent, unpredictable flares battered the shielding ships, depleting their fuel reserves at an alarming rate. Goodman listened intently to the newscasts. There was a glimmer of hope. A Barvan collective had developed a solar extraction rig, initially designed for mining exotic plasmas from the surfaces of stars in solar nurseries they controlled. The collective scientists believed that it could be repurposed to help stabilize the degrading sun. Unfortunately, the rig was large, cumbersome, and barely capable of faster-than-light travel. It would take weeks to arrive. By then, more pessimistic scientists and reporters predicted there might be little of the population or the planet itself left to save. This was when David and Charlotte saw their father sit up, his expression sharp and resolute in a way they hadn't seen before. Without a word, he grabbed the microphone for the hollow radio and flipped it to transmit as he opened a wide broadcast channel. "Not sure who all is receiving right now, but this is Granite Station. We'll be in the shadow of Italion's fifth planet as soon as we can. Hope to see some friends there." With that, Goodman shut off the channel and turned to his children. "You two, make sure the last patrons here are taken care of and happy before they're sent out. Then sweep up and lock down," he said, striding to flip the light-up sign on the window from "Yes, we're open" to "Closed, come again soon." "Meanwhile, I'll be down warming up the engines." The siblings exchanged excited looks. They couldn't recall ever seeing Granite Station actually fly anywhere, except for the occasional small booster push to maintain orbit or avoid a stray asteroid. They'd certainly never seen it jump to faster-than-light travel. Barely a quarter of an hour later, the station groaned and creaked as the star streaked past, glowing lines of blue-white as it jumped through the ether. Then, with a lurch and a deep groan that reverberated through the structure, the station dropped out of FTL travel and switched to standard thruster propulsion. In the distance, they saw a faint glimmer of the pulsing star, so small they could cover it with a thumb when looking out the window. Beyond that, Italion itself was just a distant speck, glowing unnaturally bright blue from the combined mass of shields protecting it. But then the view was abruptly obscured by a looming mass. Goodman had brought the station into orbit behind Italion's fifth planet. The planet was rocky, lifeless, and barren, save for a few failed mining attempts from ages past. Despite its lack of mineral wealth, it provided a vital physical bulwark against any flares that might stray their way. "All right, kids," Goodman said, descending the dusty ladder from the piloting tower and returning to the diner and depot. Let's make the most of this. I've updated Schwarzkopf to know about our new drop-off for fuel, water, and food. He's still doing rounds in the back end of the Garanian sphere and isn't due to the station for another week anyway. He bumped me to the top of the list, but he's got to finish over there first. So we're looking at 5 days before we see his mug poking around here." The kids nodded, and Goodman saw the spark of focus as they sprinted off to their positions, preparing the station for service once more. Returning to the radio, he opened a Target 2A broadcast limited to the Italian system. "Attention all vessels in need of refuel and restock. This is Granite Station, orbiting the 5th planet, ready for any who need to cycle out and stop by." A chorus of affirmatives replied in a dozen languages, alongside hundreds of simple chimes of acknowledgement from captains too busy or unwilling to respond verbally. Goodman had barely returned to the navigation array when landing sequence requests began trickling in. At first, there was 3 or 4 vessels, medium to small cruisers that wouldn't strain the station's fuel reserves. But the trickle quickly became a stream, with medium and larger ships arriving. Goodman's calculations showed the station's fuel reserves dwindling to barely 10% of capacity by day's end. His heart sank as he watched the incoming ships on the automatic scans. Several were visibly damaged, smoking or cracking where their shielding had started to fail, leaving them exposed to fire and radiation. Gritting his teeth, Goodman assigned landing platforms, calculated ETAs, and stretched their resources as far as they would go. The last dozen ships in the queue were warned they might leave empty-handed if the earlier arrivals consumed all the remaining fuel. Still, Goodman extended an invitation for their crews to board for a meal and a shower, or whatever hygienic ritual their species required. Then a priority chime sounded. An alert was accompanied by a clear and distinct clarion call, the unmistakable signal of the Order of the Divine Fulcrum. Renowned monks and aid workers that had been eagerly awaited by all affected along the quasar's destructive path. "Attention, Granite Station, this is the Axis of Camaraderie. We are requesting docking and refueling if you'll have us." There was a kindness in the request, but also a note of urgency. Goodman's heart sank further when he saw the size of the vessel, a full capital ship nearly 5 times the length of Granite Station itself. On a good day, they might have enough reserves to fill half of its power capacitors and fuel tanks. Now, he knew they could offer little more than a few vapors at that. Taking a deep breath, he keyed the comm. "Acknowledge Axis of Camaraderie. Unfortunately, looks like we'll be diverting you to another station." Another voice cut in over the radio, and Goodman froze, staring out the window in shock. He saw another station emerging from Lightspeed. This one was a more compact and squat affair, with large tanks of fuel replacing the diner and amenities Granite Station offered. It had far fewer landing ports and a single fueling crane. But to Goodman, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. A familiar voice came over the comm. "Howdy, you old coot," it said. "We decided we wanted to help too. Got to make sure that you're representing humanity right, huh?" Goodman's brow furrowed in confusion. "Ezekiel, is that Crimson Cove? What do you mean we? You pilot that scrap heap solo." In response, he just received a laugh. Goodman couldn't help but laugh in exhilaration as well, as more and more notification pings filled the air. Ships were emerging from hyperspeed, not warships or massive transports with shielding or evacuation capacity, but stations like his. Most were crewed by humans, and many were run by people Goodman recognized from years of cooperation and story swapping. As he watched the other stations fly into anchor orbits, he could see repair bays and docking gantries were fully deployed. He hurried about the rooms of their boarding house, flattening platform couches out into beds and putting retractable bunks from walls to transform rooms for dozens into makeshift sleeping quarters for hundreds. It wasn't luxury, but it was far better than the claustrophobic quarters and grueling schedules aboard a ship of the line. Dozens of eateries had also thrown open their doors. Goodman caught snippets over the radios of cooks and staffs issuing orders, repurposing fine dining areas into mess halls capable of feeding entire starship's crews in one sitting. And, most importantly, nearly every station carried fuel reserves, and together they had enough to refuel fleets of the largest capital ships ever built 100 times over. The Axis of Camaraderie had already docked with the Crimson Cove, and more requests for docking permissions poured in as other capital ships arrived, many showing visible signs of damage. Goodman began to wonder how many of those crews had been prepared to sacrifice everything, selling their very lives to buy just a few more hours of salvation to arrive. Now, thanks to the growing fleet of stations, those ships could cycle back, refuel, repair damage, and let their exhaust crews recover. Shields that had been held at maximum for hours or even days could remain interlocked, protecting the planet below from relentless onslaught. Goodman had lost track of how many days had passed. Swashkov had arrived 2 days earlier than Goodman's initial estimate, just in time, as the Granite station's fuel reserves were dipping dangerously close to empty. The android hadn't come alone. Instead, he brought a small flotilla of fueling tankers. "Figured with all the do-gooding going on, there's plenty of others who might need some fuel as well." When Goodman moved to pay, the robot's credit beacon malfunctioned. The android scowled good-naturedly before chuckling. "Well, I suppose if you can't pay for it, it's free," he said. Before Goodman could respond, Charlotte, sitting nearby and taking a quick breather with a tall cup of Bernhard juice, piped up, "I could probably fix that for you if you want." She was cut off by her father's raised hand. Goodman kept his eyes locked with the android. "Are you sure?" The android's multi-lens gaze shifted from Goodman to Charlotte, and then, after a long pause, back to Goodman. "I'm sure," he said. "Besides, the probability will be good for business in the long run." Goodman nodded silently, and then the android waved off any further protests before returning to his ship. Only a few hours later, Goodman stepped out to the edge of the docking platforms to catch a breath of fresh air. Granite Station's atmosphere's bubble was fresher than most, something Goodman had always taken great care to maintain. He gazed out at the thousands of ships that had cycled in for refueling and resupply, dozens more arriving by the day, helping to shield the planet and then allowing those in dire need to escape to the relative safety behind the fifth moon. Almost equal in number were the straggler stations arriving as well, almost the entire face of the sun-guarded side of the rocky planet saturated with orbiting way stations. It was a dazzling sight, a sparkling sea of colors and shapes, ships and lights. Music and chatter filled the air and radio channels, creating a sense of unity amidst the chaos. Suddenly, a low rumbling beneath his feet caused the station to gently rock. Goodman froze, worried the star might have finally erupted, rendering all their efforts futile. But as he looked up, he saw a space ripple and shift, the starfield's light bending slightly as an enormous shape dropped out of light speed. It was the collective solar miner, accompanied by a fleet of scientific support ships, here to complete the adjustments that had dominated the news of the past half week. Cheers erupted around them. Goodman could hear whoops, shouts of excitement, clapping and whistling. Crews on nearby stations waved and gestured, thrilled at the sight. The final piece of the plan had arrived. For the first time, Goodman allowed himself to hope. It might just be okay after all. In the decades that followed, Granite Station became legendary. Visitors who managed to arrive before Goodman's retirement could hardly believe that such a momentous act had been sparked by a humble station. Though the station still looked much the same, nearly every component had been replaced or updated, thanks to the generosity of those who'd benefited from its service during the crisis. If Dave is around, he'll eagerly give you a tour of the eatery, pointing out various spots where he once served alien dishes that he had only read about in books. He quickly figured out suitable recipes based on his knowledge, suggestions from the crew members, and advice from his father, doing his best to stretch a week's worth of supplies into meals for 10 times the number of people in half the time. He credits this experience as the final push, as his father would say, that urged him to pursue a career in the culinary arts. David went on to become a renowned chef for the Royal Takada. Charlotte, on the other hand, is always there, happily managing the station after Goodman retired. She can often be found in a workshop, tinkering with gadgets or updating the station's systems, chasing down any number of small quirks that arise on a vessel of that size. She, too, has her share of stories, from refueling royal cruisers to imperial warships back to back, to a particularly nerve-wracking incident involving the defusing of an unstable reactor core on a pleasure yacht. If you ask either of them where Goodman is these days, they'll glance towards the vast field of stars and say he's out there somewhere, probably stopping to offer a ride, fix a hypercoil, or share a sandwich and a story with someone in need. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.